Emergency declaration down in flames. Our reporting begins with a live look at the White House and what President Trump called a loyalty test. A vote in the Senate on whether to block the president's declaration of a national emergency at the Mexico border. Democrats stood united. Republicans are very much not. In the last hour, not a few, but 12 Republicans voted against the president.
There is a number that the White House does not want you to think about right now, and that number is 59. That is how many senators voted in 2019 to end Trump's national emergency declaration for the border wall. 12 Republicans crossed party lines and joined every Democrat in the chamber to push back against one of the most aggressive uses of presidential emergency power in modern history. Trump had to issue a veto to save it, one of the most embarrassing moments of his first term. That vote set a precedent, and the pattern it established has only accelerated since then in ways that have direct implications for the war in Iran and everything the administration is trying to do with executive authority right now. Let me walk you through the trajectory because the voting record tells a story that most coverage is ignoring. In 2019, the border wall emergency vote went 59 to 41 against Trump. 12 Republicans broke ranks on what was supposed to be a signature policy. Fast forward to early 2026, a War Powers Act resolution blocking Trump from escalating military action in Venezuela passed 52 to 47. 5 Republicans crossed over: Josh Hawley, Todd Young, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and Rand Paul. Then came 2 separate Iran War Powers resolutions seeking to require congressional approval before further strikes. Those votes came in at 47 to 48 and 48 to 52. Narrow defeats for the accountability side, but the margins were razor thin. Rand Paul backed limits on the president's war authority in both cases. Meanwhile, please leave your questions or comments in the comments section. I will answer each one individually as time permits. Also, I would be very happy if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel. Now, let's continue. Line those votes up in sequence, and you are looking at a documented pattern of bipartisan resistance to presidential emergency and war powers that has been building for years. The numbers fluctuate, but the direction is consistent. And the ideological range of the Republicans willing to cross over is what makes this particularly significant. This is not just the usual suspects. Hawley is a MAGA-line nationalist. Paul is a libertarian. Young and Collins represent traditional Republican conservatism. Murkowski has always been independent-minded. When senators from that broad a spectrum are willing to break with the president on questions of war powers and emergency authority, it tells you the resistance is institutional, not factional. It is rooted in the constitutional separation of powers, not in opposition to any specific policy. That distinction matters enormously. When a Republican senator votes to assert congressional war powers, the framing is not that they are opposing the president. The framing is that they are defending Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the clause that gives Congress, not the president, the authority to declare war and control spending. That framing provides what political analysts call a permission structure. It gives Republicans cover to break ranks without it being characterized as disloyalty to the party or to Trump personally. They are not voting against the president. They are voting for the Constitution. That is a much easier position to defend in a primary. Now consider where we are right now. The war in Iran is in its 6th week. There is no congressional authorization for it. The administration has been operating under broad executive authority claims that have been challenged but not overridden. The ceasefire announced this week is already fracturing. Israel launched over 100 strikes across Lebanon within hours of the announcement, killing at least 250 people, exposing what appears to be a deliberate loophole in the agreement. The military buildup continues underneath the ceasefire rhetoric, with the USS George H.W. Bush carrier strike group transiting toward the Gulf even as negotiations are supposedly underway in Pakistan. The economic damage is mounting daily. Gas prices are climbing. Allied economies are under strain. Egypt is rationing electricity. Australia is warning about regional fuel shortages. And the Senate votes on Iran war powers came within 1 or 2 votes of passing. 1 or 2 Republican defections away from a binding resolution requiring the president to seek congressional approval before continuing military operations. That is how thin the margin is between the current trajectory and a fundamentally different constitutional dynamic. Trump acknowledged during his first term that he could declare a national emergency and bypass Congress entirely on the border wall. He said it on camera. He said he did not need congressional approval. He said he could do it quickly. The fact that 59 senators then voted to terminate that emergency, forcing him into a veto, demonstrated that Congress was willing to push back when presidential power overreached into areas the Constitution reserves for the legislature. The question now is whether that same dynamic applies to war powers in an active conflict. The math is instructive. A veto override requires 67 votes in the Senate. The highest bipartisan vote against Trump's emergency powers was 59 in 2019. The current pattern shows 52 on Venezuela and 47 to 48 on Iran. The gap between where the Senate is now and the 67 threshold is roughly 15 to 20 additional Republican votes. That is a significant number. It is not happening tomorrow, but the trajectory is moving in one direction, and the closer the Iran war gets to a political crisis, with rising casualties, economic pain, and no exit strategy, the more pressure builds on Republican senators facing competitive 2026 midterm races to demonstrate independence from a war that polls show is increasingly unpopular. This is where the midterm calendar becomes a factor that the White House cannot ignore. Republican senators in swing states need to answer to constituents who are paying more for gasoline, watching their retirement accounts fluctuate, and wondering why a war that was supposed to last weeks is now entering its second month with ground troops deploying and no end date in sight. Every week this continues. The political calculus for those senators shifts. The cost of loyalty to the president on war powers goes up. The benefit of asserting congressional independence goes up. And the permission structure provided by the constitutional framework makes it possible to break ranks without it looking like betrayal. The two areas where Congress holds its strongest constitutional authority are spending and military action. Article 1, Section 8 is unambiguous on both counts. When a president reallocates funds without congressional approval, as Trump did with the border wall, or initiates and sustains military operations without a declaration of war or explicit authorization, as is happening now in Iran, he is operating in precisely the space where congressional resistance has the deepest constitutional foundation and the broadest bipartisan precedent. That is why these are the issues where you see crossover voting. Not on tax policy, not on judicial nominations, on money and war. Because those are the two domains where even the most partisan senator has institutional reasons to defend congressional prerogative. What makes the current moment particularly volatile is that the war and the spending are now linked in ways they were not during the border wall fight. The Iran conflict is simultaneously a war powers question and a spending question. The Pentagon has burned through billions in munitions. The economic disruption from the Strait of Hormuz closure is creating fiscal pressures across the entire government. Energy costs are rising for every federal agency. The defense industrial base is under strain. Every week the war continues. The spending question becomes harder to separate from the war powers question. And when those two constitutional triggers overlap, the coalition of senators willing to assert congressional authority expands. Because the senators who care about fiscal discipline and the senators who care about war powers authorization find themselves on the same side. The 5 Republicans who crossed over on Venezuela in 2026 are the leading indicator. Hawley's defection in particular sends a signal that this is not limited to establishment Republicans who have always been skeptical of Trump. When a MAGA-aligned senator votes to constrain presidential war powers, it creates space for others in his ideological lane to follow without being cast as anti-Trump. It reframes the question from loyalty to the president versus loyalty to the Constitution. And in that framing, the Constitution wins more often than most people expect. None of this means Trump is about to be removed or that the war is about to be defunded by Congress. The 67-vote threshold for a veto override or removal is a high bar, and the current numbers are not there. But the pattern is clear, documented, and accelerating. 59 in 2019, 52 in 2026, 47 to 48 on Iran, with margins of 1 or 2 votes. Each of those numbers represents a real roll call vote with real senators putting their names on the record against presidential overreach on war and emergency powers. The trajectory points in one direction. And as the midterms approach, as the war drags on, as the economic costs deepen, and as more Republican senators in competitive states calculate the political risk of unlimited loyalty to a conflict with no end date, that trajectory has room to steepen. The Senate is not a rubber stamp. It has not been won on these issues even during the periods when it looked like one on everything else. The documented history of crossover voting on war powers and emergency authority is the clearest evidence that institutional resistance to unchecked presidential power is alive in the chamber, even if it has not yet reached the threshold to override. The border wall vote proved the Senate will push back on emergency powers. The Venezuela vote proved it will push back on war powers. The Iran votes proved it is one or two defections away from doing both simultaneously on the most consequential military conflict since Iraq. The question for the coming months is straightforward. How many more weeks of war? How many more billions in spending? How many more economic disruptions? How many more flag-draped caskets does it take before that 48 becomes 51, and 51 becomes something the White House can no longer ignore? The precedent exists. The constitutional framework exists. The ideological permission structure for Republican crossover exists. The only question is timing. And wars that drag on without resolution have a way of accelerating timelines that once seemed impossibly slow.